I'm Logan Crawford, and right now on Spotlight, we are talking about making the world a better place, making the economies of the world stronger. The question for you is, how do we do that? We do it, according to Eric Gribble, who is an author and an expert, by empowering the individual. In fact, he has written a book by that name. It is called Individual Empowerment: A Way to Build a Better Economy. It takes a look at the situation in Australia, but certainly there are broad implications here as well for countries around the globe. And we are delighted to have Eric here today on Spotlight. Eric, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm grateful to be able to express my opinions. Yeah.
My pleasure, my pleasure. To the folks at home, could you just tell us what your book is all about?
Well, I became concerned that we're virtually, for a process of gradualism, we're gradually moving towards an Orwellian society, and that government has been steadily growing, and it's been happening for a gradual process, and every aspect of our lives is becoming more and more controlled. For example, years ago, people used to be more self-reliant. For example, if you can go right back to 100 years ago, people would just go and build a house for themselves if they wanted to. Nowadays, you have to be a registered builder. Sure, some regulation is necessary, but the more regulation you impose, the less people are self-reliant, and the less they're able to move from job to job at a time when we need a more flexible workforce. And it's just every aspect of our life was becoming more and more regulated, and government was steadily growing. And I just had this uneasy feeling, and I believed it was a good idea to actually express my thoughts in a book and express an alternative way of doing things. So,
what do you think has happened to our society? Like you said, we used to have this feeling that we could pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, get it done ourselves. We didn't need help from anyone. Charity was considered a handout. We just wanted government to get out of the way. And now we're looking for affordable housing to be built for us, for people to go fund me. I mean, it's just a changed society, a changed way of looking at life.
yeah, it's been a process of gradualism, as I said, but it's hard to put your finger on it, but it's something that's really creeped up on us.
Yeah.
Um,
A lot of it seems to have been incremental.
There's been a steady growth of government is the biggest factor. See, if you go back until back to the 1920s in New Zealand anyway, the tax rate was about 15% of GDP. Now the government take is 40%, and that represents a steady growth of government. And I don't really know why there hasn't been that awareness of what's happening, but there doesn't seem to be. And I don't know, it's it's been a complete loss of self-reliance with just using government. We expect government to have all the solutions, and government doesn't.
Right.
People have to understand that government does not create wealth. All it does is take by force and spend.
Exactly, exactly.
And
I think it might have started out with good intentions, but they say the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I mean, here in this country, we had FDR who tried to basically create a welfare state by creating certain social safety nets, and they were good. You know, we needed Social Security, that type of thing for people who didn't plan for retirement. But slowly but surely, it seems like you built a society that's based upon people who don't plan, who don't prepare, who don't take care of themselves. And the people who do take care of themselves are penalized. Like you said, the government takes by force.
As far as social issues go, there's another thing that's happened in our society too. And once again, it's because of the same thing about government trying to protect everyone. And we do need a social safety net, but what's happening is young people usually go out and go into their own homes, yet at one time the family didn't break up, and you had different generations. You used to have parents and grandparents even living in the same home. And the older generation used to act as mentors to the younger generation. But today, because of the way society is structured, and because of the belief that young people should have rights and should be able to go out and do their own things and get government assistance for doing it, there's been a complete separation of the young generation from the older generation. So there's no longer any mentoring. The older generation used to mentor the young generation in basic life skills. And at the same time, we have older generation who are sort of being pushed aside from our society and are sort of living their own lives in isolation. And the strategy is to get the two groups together again. And I actually like the idea of a system of compulsory mentoring for people who are welfare beneficiaries.
Mentoring
but it
can't
have to be very well organised, because you can't put older people in a dangerous situation if they're going to be going to homes as mentors. And I don't mean compulsory for the older generation. I mean compulsory for the welfare recipients. The older generation, it's a voluntary system, which could be a top up to their pension or whatever. So such a system makes a lot of sense to me, but I don't know why people haven't thought of these things before. Why they're not a big, why government hasn't actually considered these issues. Yeah.
It's sort of like we've forgotten from whence we came. We forgot that people used to mentor people, that people used to be apprentices, that the younger generation used to learn from the older generation. And that was a way of empowering the individual that was much greater than some type of government agency trying to help people, because you had the personal investment of a mentor to the mentee.
Oh, dude, right. Government is was a very blunt instrument, and that government can't see individual circumstances. Everyone's individual circumstances are different. So that's why one of the failings of government, because they're a very blunt instrument, and they bring in broad policies which affects everyone the same, whereas everyone's situation is different.
Exactly. People are fed up with government. They seem angry with politicians. They seem like they've taken extreme sides on the right and left. What do you think's behind all that?
Well, America in particular has become a very divided country, but yeah, I think there is a real level of frustration. Yeah, there seems to be a massive divide between right and left nowadays. Yeah, I can't really explain that one.
But people are divided more than ever. They are very frustrated with government, and they want change. And the changes you propose to make a better world, a better economy, seem to make sense. Let's go through some of the points in the book for the audience.
Yes, certainly. First of all, the real issue for me is that there's been steady technological change, rapid change in the sciences and engineering and everything else, but we still have institutions that go back more than 100 years that haven't actually been changed within government. Now, certain institutions are necessary for the preservation of democracy, obviously, but other institutions, the trouble is, in the sciences, engineers and scientists think analytically, and that they have to, work through equations and alter equations and work out the best way of doing things. Whereas with law and accountancy, which is what predominates in government, people learn through memory. It's memory-based learning, and the idea that the rule book should be thrown out is completely alien to them. It's about complying with the rule book. But so that's why there has been so little reform in the government sector. But I'll give you an example: the taxation system. Now, the income tax system has become so complex because different governments all adapt the income tax system to their pet projects. Like they might give rebates for something in particular, or and then you've got the depreciation system is so complex that you've got a whole army of accountants as estate planners trying to minimise people's income bills, and it's become so complex that even the tax department doesn't understand it. That's why people quite regularly take the tax department to court and win.
Exactly. I mean, if you call up the IRS in this country and ask for tax advice, depending on who answers the phone, you'll get 2, 3, 4, 5 different opinions.
Yeah. It's because of the complexity of it, and it's yet interestingly, if you reform the whole thing, made the whole thing simply goods and services tax, and got rid of income tax altogether, this was actually proposed by a finance minister in New Zealand many years ago called Roger Douglas, and he actually had it costed out by the largest financial institutions in the country at the time. And it was actually theoretically possible to replace the entire income tax system with a goods and services tax. Part of the problem, I think, is because one of the problems is governments have been confusing the income tax or the role of revenue collecting with the role of social welfare.
Yeah.
But so if you replaced income tax with a goods and services tax, it changes the emphasis from income or production earning to spending, taxing on spending, which is actually a good change. But also, because it's across the board, it becomes, there's no exceptions, and it's very simple, just having a basic flat tax on all goods and all services. So it just simplifies the whole system, and it does away with the entire estate planning, need for estate planning, which is something like 3% of New Zealand's economy. I'm talking about New Zealand because that's where it originally came from. Is 3% of gross national product is the cost of collecting revenue, which is crazy.
Yeah.
So
I think a lot of the tax system nowadays is used to try to create some kind of equity by choosing winners and losers, and you make too much, so you're going to pay more. You don't pay enough or don't earn enough, so you're going to get more. And this whole type of social engineering through the tax system is ludicrous.
Yeah, I'm not recommending this, but if you think about it, if you want the economy to grow fast, you should be helping the most profitable businesses, not the worst performing ones, which is exactly opposite to what's being done. Exactly. Logically, if you really think about it logically, but I'm not recommending you should do that. It should be a level playing field. But that's just why a lot of what is happening is illogical. As far as what was I going to talk about? Yeah, goods and services taxes. It's a very flat tax, but it's also a regressive tax, in that people who are poor, on low income, spend proportionately more of their income on basic living expenses, which is why a goods and services tax, as I described, affects low income people more. But that can be compensated for by, if you have a completely privatized health, education, everything else, and then have a system where you have education accounts for everyone, so people can go to whatever school they want. But that account is topped up for low-income people. For higher-income people, it's reduced, and likewise for health, compulsory health insurance, subsidised for low-income and reduced for higher-income people. And that way, you're sort of, by these methods, you can actually reduce the regressive impact of goods and services taxes.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
You tackle a lot of big issues in your book. Let's touch upon some of them. One of them is loss of manufacturing jobs. Tell me how we can bring back those manufacturing jobs.
Yeah, that's a good thing. Well, the biggest thing is excessive regulations is actually holding back manufacturing. They're grossly over-regulated, and so this is an example of what's happening with China. You've got fewer regulations, and this is one of a number of reasons why China is actually growing far faster than the West, because they haven't over-regulated their manufacturing sector. And we've just put more and more regulations, even safety regulations. I know an employer needs to be responsible for the safety of the employee, but some of these regulations are over the top. I mean, some of it doesn't even make logical sense. Why is it that it's perfectly legal for a person, if they're a sports person, to climb up mountains without ropes or any safety gear? But if you're doing something productive, you have to have all the safety harnesses, everything else. I'm not saying you shouldn't, but what I'm saying is there's a big discrepancy, and a lot of it just doesn't make sense.
Absolutely.
So it's almost as if we're penalising productivity. And
it's interesting. You talk about the loss of manufacturing jobs, but you also talk about the approaching climate crisis. Some people would say they're at odds with each other. What do you say about that?
Yeah, well, a climate crisis, I just don't. I agree that there is, increasing carbon dioxide levels. The ratio of increasing carbon dioxide does increase the temperatures, but the way we're going about it is absolutely crazy. I mean, the answer to it, the problem with renewables is that we don't have any way of realistically backing up when the wind's not blowing. If it's nighttime and the wind's not blowing, what do you do? It's okay for some countries that are predominantly hydro countries like New Zealand, because you just hold back water in the dams and they don't need to back up. But as far as a place like the United States, the battery revolution is non-existent. Even though people say there's a battery revolution, it's just too expensive to back up by battery. Pumped hydro is crazy. So realistically, there's just no backup, but so you can only get. So the answer is, well, once again, you need to take government controls of things, because nuclear energy is actually the solution. But the trouble is, once again, it's government getting in the way. They've put so many requirements on nuclear energy. I've been listening to what Robert Zubrin, who's a nuclear engineer, has been saying, and some of the requirements on nuclear is just ridiculous. Like, before you can get a project approved, the nuclear industry has to prove that there's not a better alternative use for the land, for example. I mean, what's that about? And
nothing would ever get built, nothing would ever get done if, when you proposed to do something, you had to show that there weren't alternative uses for the piece of real estate that you were going to use. I mean, particularly in this era where we're trying to create clean energy and sustainable green cars, if we don't have nuclear power, we're just shifting the problem from the cities to the country with coal-fired power plants, right?
Oh, dead right, yeah. And I believe in a concept called energy density. I used to have, look, energy density is nuclear because it's a very dense form of energy. And for example, the environmental movement insists is opposed to storage depositories for nuclear waste, for example. And I can't understand the logic of it because it's forcing nuclear power plants to store waste inside the plant, which is quite often in a dangerous area. And it's almost as if we're trying to create a situation because nuclear waste is so dense that it's not an issue. If you think about it, we come from, we're in a radioactive environment anyway. We are constantly.
The critics will point to, like I said, the critics will point to Chernobyl. They'll point to the Fukushima meltdown. So they'll talk about these big disasters, which doesn't happen at a coal-fired power plant. How do we square away those issues, the fear of a big nuclear catastrophe at one of these plants like Chernobyl or 3 Mile Island or what have you?
Well, first of all, it would be good if the media could actually publish the truth.
That's hard to do.
Yeah, it is.
It is.
Chernobyl, from what I understand, listening to Robert Zubrin, just about all nuclear power stations are water moderated, in that a nuclear power plant can't actually function without water. Water actually moderates the reaction, and if it starts to melt down, the water actually gets too hot and evaporates, and once the water's gone, it can no longer moderate, and the reaction actually shuts down. But Chernobyl was one of the few graphite moderated power plants that were built. So that's why this is why they had that disaster at Chernobyl. And then you've got a total mismatch between the fear of radiation and the reality. My understanding is only about 49 people are confirmed to have died at Chernobyl, not one as a result of radiation. Not one person is confirmed to have died at Fukushima as a result of when it was actually a tidal wave that caused all the deaths. So there's a total mismatch between public perceptions of radiation and what the actual danger is.
Exactly. Well, there seems to be an epidemic of false news coverage out there for sure. I think we're aware of it now, fortunately, because of our former president here in the United States. And it's been pointed out and demonstrated. I mean, that the news media will distort, they will lie, they will say whatever they need to say to create a better story. And it's really unfair to the people who are watching, the people who believe it, and the people in government who are making decisions based on these erroneous reports. This is a great book. You cover so much, so many aspects of life and society. Tell me what it was like writing it.
It was quite good actually, because I just put my thoughts down on paper over time. I was originally in a small political party in New Zealand, which was more or less what you call a classic liberal party. Liberal means something different in the United States. It's a sort of just a word has been hijacked, whereas liberal means libertarian or minimum government, really. This is what the term should mean. But somehow or other, the left has hijacked the term in the United States. So it means something totally different. Yeah. I was a member of a small classical liberal party, and over time, I just put my different thoughts down on paper and then condensed it into a book. So that's sort of how it happened. It wasn't too difficult, really.
Are you based in New Zealand or are you based in Australia?
I'm in Australia, yeah.
Okay. All right.
I immigrated to Australia some time ago.
Gotcha. And tell me a little bit about lockdown there, because that kind of pertains also to the situation with government, individual empowerment, and people making their own choices and getting rid of the nanny state. What was it like? I know in New Zealand, they had a very strict lockdown, I understand, and it was a little more liberal in Australia?
Well, it varied from state to state. It was fairly liberal where I am at, which is New South Wales. Victoria had very strict lockdowns, which were ridiculous, really.
Mm.
The whole COVID thing was, I don't know, it went out of control. Because
I think it was a power grab by government. I mean, I think, you know, you talk about this in your book, the fact that government kind of has an overreach in our lives. I think the ultimate overreach, and that's why I brought it up, was the response during the COVID pandemic. We are all adults. We can decide if we're going to get vaccines. We can decide if we're going to be in crowds. We can decide if we're going to stay home alone and hide ourselves from a virus, right? We have that ability to make those decisions ourselves.
Right. You should have control over your own body, what you put in your own body. And there's a lot of dispute over the safety of a lot of these vaccines. But one thing I found interesting about this whole COVID thing is right at the very start, they were talking about how COVID mainly affected obese people and elderly people. And I said right at the start, I guarantee that the third world will be relatively unaffected by COVID. And it has been. Folks, I reckon only about, I read an article, I reckon only about 5 or 6% of Africa has been vaccinated, but COVID's disappeared from Africa. So it's interesting. It's just a total overreaction by government.
Absolutely. Well, there's a lot of overreaction by government. There's a lot of overreach by government. Eric Gribble addresses major points about this in his book, Individual Empowerment, A Way to a Better Economy. It's a way to a better economy. It's a way to a better world. It's a way to better individuals. And that's what this book is all about. It is highly recommended. It's a fascinating read. And I think you'll have a paradigm shift on what the role of government and the individual are all about once you're done reading this book. I know I did. Eric Gribble, thank you so much for joining us here today on Spotlight.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
My pleasure. Fascinating speaking with you. And to the folks at home, I'm Logan Crawford, thanking you for your time this time. Until next time on Spotlight.